I don't think that we can ever have peace with my family unless the truth is out there.
William couldn't hold back tears. What Catherine found in Queen Camilla's jewelry box shocked UK. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the title is not about a glamorous piece of royal jewelry. It is about a discovery that, in this account, left William struggling to control his emotions. Catherine had reportedly uncovered a sapphire brooch associated with Princess Diana inside a private jewelry box linked to Queen Camilla, and the object appeared to raise questions about where it had been kept and why its history was so difficult to trace. The discovery became more disturbing when the brooch was examined more closely. According to the story being investigated, it was not simply an old jewel sitting among other possessions. It appeared to connect directly to Diana, William's mother, while the records surrounding its transfer remained unclear. Then Catherine noticed something beneath it, something that would turn a troubling discovery into a far deeper mystery. Catherine did not immediately confront anyone. She stopped. She looked again. The box remained open in front of her, its contents arranged with the kind of care that suggested the pieces had not been forgotten. The sapphire caught the light, but what held her attention was the possibility that this was an item the family believed had disappeared from view. If that suspicion was correct, someone had known where it was. Hi viewers, if you believe Diana's memories should never be hidden from her sons, comment "Protect Diana" right now. A simple comment tells the story where you stand, and if this discovery matters to you, subscribe, like, and share it, because silence is exactly what allows important questions to disappear. Catherine then alerted the appropriate royal collection officials rather than turning the discovery into an immediate public confrontation. A confidential inventory review was considered necessary. The purpose was simple: establish what the brooch was, where it had been recorded, and whether there was any reason for it to be inside a jewelry collection. That was when the atmosphere changed. The first problem was not the sapphire itself. It was the paperwork. The story alleges that the brooch did not have the clear transfer trail investigators would expect for an item of this significance. There was no simple explanation waiting in an inventory book, no obvious record that could settle the question in a few minutes. Instead, there was uncertainty. And uncertainty is dangerous inside a family built around records, tradition, ceremony, and carefully preserved possessions. Catherine reportedly remained focused on the object, while officials began checking older entries. The brooch had to be compared with photographs, descriptions, and historical references. Every detail mattered. The shape of the setting mattered. The arrangement of the stones mattered. Even the condition of the piece mattered. The more the details appeared to align, the harder it became to dismiss the discovery as an ordinary mistake. But there was still a question Catherine could not answer. How had it reached that box? The answer could not simply be that someone had misplaced it. If the brooch had been missing from official view for years,
arch nemesis. Strong words.
There has always been this competition between us, weirdly. Again, I think it really plays into, or is played by, the heir spare.
There should have been some point at which its location changed. There should have been a record, a transfer, an explanation, or at the very least a documented uncertainty. Instead, the trail appeared to become thinner. That was the moment the story stopped being about jewelry. It became about memory. For Catherine, the emotional weight came from knowing what Diana represented to William and to the family. A jewel associated with Diana was never merely an expensive object. It carried photographs, memories, grief, and a connection to a woman whose life had remained intensely present in the public imagination long after her death. And now, according to this account, one of those reminders had surfaced in a place where nobody expected to find it. The discovery also created a delicate problem for the palace. Examining a public collection is one thing. Examining possessions held in a private royal space is something else entirely. The story alleges that there was resistance to staff examining Camilla's personal jewelry, which immediately raised the temperature around the investigation. That resistance did not prove wrongdoing, but it made the unanswered question harder to ignore. Why would a routine inventory check become so sensitive? Catherine understood that the safest path was evidence. No accusations, no dramatic announcement, no rushing to the press. Just the object, the records, and the facts that could be established. The brooch was secured for examination. Photographs were taken, details were noted, old records were requested. Then one detail stopped the room cold. The brooch was not accompanied by the documentation everyone expected. And suddenly, the discovery had a second layer. Someone had not simply found a jewel, someone had found a gap in the royal record. There was another reason the officials treated the object carefully. A disputed royal heirloom can create questions far beyond its monetary value. Provenance matters because every transfer creates a chain. When that chain is incomplete, even a beautiful object can become evidence of a much larger administrative problem. The investigators therefore had to resist the temptation to reach a conclusion too quickly. The brooch could not simply be declared Diana's because it looked familiar. It had to be compared against surviving descriptions and images, and every match had to be recorded. That process made the silence around its history even more striking. Catherine, meanwhile, was facing a different kind of pressure. She had found something personal, but she also understood that one careless accusation could turn a private investigation into a public family war. So she waited for the records. What she did not know was that the records were about to produce another surprise. An older entry appeared to reference a sapphire jewel connected to Diana, yet the wording was frustratingly incomplete. There was no straightforward explanation of its final destination. The entry seemed to point toward a later inventory, but that later record did not clearly identify the same piece. For William, it meant the discovery could no longer be dismissed as an emotional misunderstanding. And for the palace, it meant a question was forming that nobody could answer with a simple sentence. That was when William was informed. He did not need a long explanation. Catherine showed him the evidence that had been gathered so far, and the emotional impact was clear. The story describes him staring at the brooch in silence, confronted not by its value, but by the memory attached to it. For years, Diana's sons had lived with the knowledge that many of their mother's personal possessions had been dispersed, preserved, inherited, or placed into collections. But seeing a piece believed to have been lost appear inside a private jewelry box carried a different kind of weight. William's reaction was not presented as anger at first. It was grief. The sapphire represented a mother who had died when he was still young. It represented memories that could never be recreated.
Feeding the British press with lies, mistruths, disinformation. The way that I can correct those mistruths is by writing something, the truth, in one place without going through the same people that they chose to go through.
And now there was a possibility that something connected to her had been sitting behind a closed door while the family believed it was gone. Then Catherine told him there was something else. The brooch was not the only thing she had found. Beneath it was a sealed, handwritten note. That single detail changed everything. Because if the note really contained the instruction attributed to Queen Elizabeth, and if it really stated that the jewel was to be preserved for William's future wife, then the mystery was no longer about a missing brooch. It was about an instruction. It was about who knew, and it was about why that instruction had apparently not been followed. William looked at Catherine, then back at the evidence. The tears came before the answers did. And the next part was about to reveal why that piece of paper mattered far more than the sapphire itself. So stay with this story, because if the brooch was shocking, what investigators found in the records next was even harder to explain, and turning away now means missing the question that could change everything. The first record did not clear the mystery, it made it worse. By the following morning, the confidential review had moved beyond the brooch itself. Investigators were no longer asking whether the sapphire looked familiar. They were asking a much harder question. When had the jewel last been formally recorded, and who had authority to move it? That distinction mattered. A missing entry could mean an administrative mistake. A missing transfer could mean something much more serious. The only way to know was to follow the paper trail backward, one inventory at a time. The review began with older royal collection records and private property schedules. Dates were compared. Descriptions were checked against photographs. Names of custodians were noted. Every reference to sapphire jewelry connected with Diana was pulled aside for closer examination. The earliest documents did not provide an easy answer. Some entries described pieces by appearance rather than by name. Others used broad terms such as sapphire brooch or royal heirloom. That made identification difficult, especially when several jewels shared similar settings. But one detail kept appearing. A sapphire brooch associated with Diana had been mentioned in earlier records, yet its later location was not consistently identified. The trail seemed to become uncertain after a change in household arrangements. That was the first serious crack in the explanation. If the brooch had been transferred properly, there should have been a receiving record. If it had been placed into storage, there should have been a storage reference. If it had been returned to a private owner, there should have been documentation showing when and why. Instead, the trail became fragmented. The investigators reportedly began checking records surrounding the years after Diana's death. This was delicate territory. Personal possessions, estate matters, royal household property, and private gifts did not always appear in the same system. That meant the absence of one entry could not automatically prove concealment. Still, the pattern was troubling enough to justify a deeper review. Catherine remained outside the formal examination. Her role was important because she had discovered the object, but she did not control the investigation. That separation mattered. It allowed the records to be tested without turning the process into a personal accusation. Meanwhile, William was left with the most uncomfortable part of the story. He had seen the brooch. He knew what it could represent, but he still did not know how it had reached the place where Catherine found it. Then the investigators located another reference. It was not a complete transfer document. It was an inventory description from an earlier period that appeared to correspond with the same type of sapphire setting. The wording was not enough to establish ownership, but it narrowed the search. The brooch had not simply vanished from history, it had moved through a system. The question was where the system had lost track of it. That discovery pushed the review toward private household inventories. Those records were more difficult to interpret because personal possessions could be documented differently from items belonging to the formal royal collection. And that was where the investigation encountered a sensitive boundary. The brooch was reportedly listed within material connected to a private royal household rather than the main public collection. The description was not explicit enough to name Diana. It referred instead to a sapphire heirloom. That wording mattered. A vague description could protect privacy. It could also make a disputed transfer almost impossible to trace. The investigators therefore began comparing.
I'd been planning it for a while, but as every guy out there will know, it takes a certain amount of motivation to get yourself going. So I was planning it, and then it just felt really right out in Africa. It was beautiful at the time, and I had done a little bit of planning to obviously share my romantic side.
Okay, you've been on holiday a while, so did you see this coming? Was he getting
No.
nervous and jumpy?
No, not at all, no, because we were out there with friends and things, so I really didn't expect it at all. I thought he might have sort of maybe thought about it, but no. It was a total shock when it came, and very excited.
And producer Ray?
Comparing dates. When had the item entered the private inventory? Who was responsible for recording it? Was there a signature? Was there a receipt? Was there a note authorizing its movement? Was there evidence that Diana's estate had transferred it? The answers were incomplete, and the more questions they asked, the more uncomfortable the situation became. This was not proof that anyone had deliberately taken the brooch. That conclusion could not be reached from an incomplete record alone, but the lack of a clean chain of custody meant the jewel could not simply be dismissed as an ordinary family keepsake. Then came another complication. The story surrounding Diana's personal jewelry had always involved different categories of ownership. Some pieces were personal possessions. Others were associated with royal events or institutional collections. Some were gifts. Some had historical connections that made their ownership difficult to summarize in a single sentence. That distinction gave investigators a reason to slow down. If the brooch had been Diana's personal property, its history could be examined through her estate. If it had been a royal loan, the rules would be different. If it had been transferred as a private gift, there should have been evidence of that arrangement. The investigation now depended on establishing which category applied. That was when Catherine's discovery became more consequential. The physical object could potentially answer questions the paperwork could not. Its condition could reveal how it had been stored. Its setting could be compared with older photographs. Its markings could be examined. Even small details could help establish whether this was the same piece that had appeared in earlier records. The examination reportedly strengthened the connection, but it also raised a new question about why the brooch had remained outside obvious public documentation for so long. That question was beginning to reach beyond the jewel. It was reaching toward the people who had handled the records. A confidential inquiry inside a royal household can move slowly for a simple reason. Every person involved understands the consequences of getting the answer wrong. An innocent administrative error can become a scandal if it is described carelessly. A genuine discrepancy can become worse if nobody is willing to investigate it. William therefore faced a difficult choice. He could demand an immediate explanation and risk turning an unresolved question into a public confrontation. Or he could wait for the records to speak first. He chose patience. That patience did not mean indifference. According to the account, he wanted the evidence assembled before anyone was accused of ignoring Diana's wishes or Queen Elizabeth's instructions. That distinction became crucial, because the investigation had not yet reached the note. It had not yet established who knew about it, and it had not yet answered whether the instruction attributed to Elizabeth was genuine, current, or connected to the brooch at all. At that stage, there were only fragments. A sapphire, an uncertain inventory trail, a private jewelry box, and a sealed handwritten note waiting to be examined. The palace could still explain the entire matter as a mistake, but one thing had already changed. The question was no longer whether Catherine had found an old jewel. The question was whether the records had failed to tell the whole story. And if that sounds like a question worth ignoring, remember that every person who refuses to ask it leaves the missing answer exactly where it has been for years. Stay with this, because the next discovery does not merely deepen the mystery. It puts Queen Elizabeth's alleged final instruction at the center of it. The next stage was provenance. Investigators began with the object itself rather than assumptions about ownership. They examined the stones, the mounting, the clasp, and signs of age. Then they compared those details with archived photographs associated with Diana. That did not prove the brooch's identity by itself, but it made another possibility difficult to dismiss. The piece could be the same jewel referenced in older records. Correspondence was checked for references to sapphire jewelry. Household notes were reviewed for movements between residences. Storage records were examined for periods when possessions had been packed, transported, or reorganized. Several explanations remained possible. The brooch could have been misclassified, it could have been stored separately, it could have changed hands during a household move without being properly entered into a later inventory. But none of those explanations answered the uncomfortable question: why was it inside Camilla's private jewelry box? That fact pulled the inquiry back to 3 points: the private box, the incomplete record, and the sealed note. Catherine was reportedly informed that the handwritten document would require separate examination. A note attributed to Queen Elizabeth could not be accepted because it looked convincing. Its paper had to be assessed, its handwriting had to be compared, its date had to be established. Most importantly, investigators had to determine whether it was connected to the brooch. Until then, it remained evidence to examine, not proof. Yet its existence alone had changed the atmosphere. The investigation now involved more than an inventory. It involved an alleged royal instruction concerning a jewel associated with Diana and William's future wife. And somewhere inside that sealed paper could be the answer to the question that had begun the investigation. Who knew? Who recorded it? And who failed to act all along? If you believe questions this serious should never be buried, subscribe and share this story, because the next chapter opens the note that could change the meaning of what Catherine found. The envelope was still sealed when the room fell silent. Nobody touched it at first. The brooch had already raised enough questions, but the small envelope beside it carried a different kind of danger. A jewel could be examined, photographed, catalogued, and placed into a secure case. A handwritten instruction was different. It could reveal intention. The investigators reportedly treated the envelope with unusual caution. The handwriting appeared familiar, but familiarity was not enough. If the document was genuinely connected to Queen Elizabeth, its date, paper, ink, and wording could change the entire investigation. Catherine was told that the note could not simply be opened and read aloud. Its authenticity had to be considered first. That delay was frustrating, but it also prevented the most explosive claim from being accepted without scrutiny. The question was no longer whether the sapphire belonged in a particular inventory. The question was whether someone had once written down exactly where it was supposed to go. That distinction mattered to William. He had spent the previous days watching the evidence become more complicated. Now the investigation had reached something personal. If the note really contained an instruction concerning his future wife, then Catherine's discovery had uncovered more than a disputed heirloom. It had uncovered an alleged decision made at the highest level of the family. The envelope was examined under controlled conditions. The paper showed signs of age. The seal had remained intact. The writing on the front appeared to identify its intended recipient, but the precise wording was not immediately disclosed. Investigators wanted to establish whether the document had been created during the period claimed by the story. Then the handwriting comparison began. Samples from Queen Elizabeth's known correspondence were examined alongside the writing on the envelope. The comparison was treated as a technical question rather than an emotional one. Similar strokes could raise confidence. Differences could end the theory immediately. For the people waiting outside the room, every minute seemed longer. Catherine reportedly remained composed, but the significance of the document was obvious. If it proved unrelated to the brooch, the mystery would return to the inventory trail. If it proved authentic and connected, the investigation would move into far more sensitive territory. The first assessment did not settle everything, but it did something more important. It justified taking the note seriously. The document was then opened under supervision. Inside was a short handwritten message. According to the account, the note stated that the sapphire brooch was to be preserved for William's future wife. That sentence changed the room. There was no elaborate explanation, no long family history. Just an instruction attributed to Queen Elizabeth and connected to a jewel associated with Diana. Catherine reportedly read the words more than once. The meaning appeared simple, the implications were not. If the instruction was genuine, the intended recipient had eventually become Catherine. Yet the brooch had not reached her through a clear public transfer. It had appeared inside a private jewelry box connected to Camilla. That created the central contradiction. The jewel had an alleged destination. The jewel had a documented history. And somewhere between those 2 points, something had gone wrong. William was brought into the discussion after the note had been examined. This time, his reaction was different from the earlier shock over the brooch. He did not focus on the sapphire first. He focused on the handwriting. The story describes him recognizing the significance of the instruction immediately. His grandmother had died years earlier, but an alleged handwritten message could suddenly place her voice inside a dispute that had begun with his mother's jewelry. For William, the emotional connection was difficult to separate from the evidence. The note did not accuse Camilla. It did not name a culprit. It did not explain how the brooch had entered the private collection. That silence was precisely what made it powerful. It left the investigators with a question that could not be answered by emotion. Who had been responsible for carrying out the instruction? That question sent the inquiry back into the records. Names of custodians were reviewed. Private inventory changes were examined. Periods of household transition were mapped against the available documentation. Investigators wanted to know whether the brooch had been moved after the alleged instruction, or whether it had already been stored elsewhere. The answer remained incomplete. Some records described the jewel indirectly. Others did not mention it at all. That did not prove deliberate concealment. It created an unresolved chain that required explanation. Catherine understood the difference. She reportedly pushed for the investigation to remain evidence-based. She did not want a family dispute built around assumptions. If the note was genuine, the records had to show what happened afterward. That position mattered because the story was beginning to attract exactly the kind of attention the palace wanted to avoid. A single photograph of the brooch could generate headlines. A handwritten note attributed to Queen Elizabeth could generate something much larger. It could reopen old arguments about royal possessions, private collections, family relationships, and the handling of Diana's legacy. The palace therefore faced a difficult choice: keep the investigation private until every detail was established, or acknowledge that an unusual discovery had taken place. For the moment, silence prevailed. But silence did not stop questions from spreading. Staff members who knew an inquiry was underway began to understand that the issue was no longer limited to an unidentified sapphire. The existence of the note meant there was potentially a written instruction behind the jewel, and written instructions create accountability. Someone may have received it, someone may have stored it, someone may have known about it, someone may have failed to act. Those possibilities were still being investigated. Then another detail emerged from the paperwork. The alleged instruction did not appear in the ordinary inventory material that investigators had already reviewed. That absence became important. If the note had been preserved alongside the brooch, why had its existence not been reflected in the records? If the brooch had been intended for William's future wife, why was there no obvious notation identifying that intention? There were possible explanations. The note could have been kept privately. It could have been separated from the official records. It could have been forgotten. Or the documentation could simply have been incomplete. No conclusion could be reached yet. But the unanswered questions were multiplying. And William was beginning to understand that finding the brooch was only the beginning. He reportedly asked for the investigation to continue without public accusations. The priority was to establish the chain of custody and determine whether the note had any formal standing. That decision frustrated those hoping for an immediate confrontation, but it also increased the tension, because every additional record had the potential to identify who had handled the jewel. The story had started with a jewelry box. Now it involved a handwritten instruction, an uncertain chain of custody, and a royal family trying to determine whether a promise made years earlier had been ignored. Catherine's role had changed as well. She was no longer simply the person who found the brooch. She had become the person who brought the hidden question into the open. There was also a practical issue that could not be ignored. Even if the handwriting appeared consistent with known examples, investigators still needed to establish the document's provenance. A genuine signature did not automatically prove that every sentence had been written by the monarch, or that the instruction remained legally binding. The paper could have been personal correspondence, rather than a formal estate directive. That distinction would become crucial later. For William, however, the emotional meaning was already difficult to escape. The note appeared to connect 3 generations of the family through one object. Diana's sapphire had become linked to Elizabeth's alleged instruction and Catherine's discovery. What had seemed like a forgotten piece of jewelry was now sitting at the center of a question about memory, inheritance, and trust. Nobody inside the investigation could yet say who had failed to follow the instruction, but the possibility was enough to make every new record feel heavier. The next answer would have to come from the private side of the story, where explanations could no longer remain abstract. That was where officials were heading next, toward questions nobody inside the palace could comfortably postpone. And the most uncomfortable question was now unavoidable. If Queen Elizabeth really intended the sapphire to reach William's future wife, how did it end up somewhere else? The answer was still buried in the records. But the next stage would bring the investigation directly toward the person whose private jewelry box had started the entire crisis. If you think William and Catherine deserve the full truth, do not scroll away now, because the next chapter takes this from a hidden record to a confrontation, and what happens when Camilla is asked to explain the jewel is where this story gets much harder to ignore. Camilla's answer came before the palace had finished deciding how to ask the question. She was reportedly informed that the disputed sapphire was now subject to a confidential provenance review. The request was narrow. Officials wanted access to the relevant private inventory records and any documentation showing how the brooch had entered the collection. The response, according to the account, was not an immediate agreement. Camilla objected to staff examining her personal possessions. That objection changed the mood inside the palace. Until that point, investigators could treat the matter as a records problem. Now there was resistance surrounding the very place where the disputed jewel had been found. Resistance alone did not establish guilt. A private collection remains private, even inside a royal household. But the investigators needed answers. and the answers could not be obtained without examining the chain of custody. William reportedly understood that distinction. He did not demand a public accusation. He wanted the records opened and the provenance tested. If Camilla had a legitimate explanation, the documentation should settle the matter. That was the pressure point. The palace had competing interests. One was protecting personal privacy. The other was establishing whether an heirloom connected to Diana had been handled according to the family's own procedures. Behind closed doors, officials began narrowing the dates. The question was no longer simply when the brooch had been discovered. Investigators wanted to know when it had entered the private collection, who had recorded it, and whether anyone had authorized that movement. Several records reportedly contained descriptions that were too vague to provide a final answer. A sapphire brooch could refer to more than one object, but when those descriptions were compared with the physical characteristics of the recovered piece, the connection became harder to dismiss. Then investigators examined the period surrounding major household changes. That was where another gap appeared. The available paperwork did not provide a clean explanation for the transition from an item associated with Diana to an object held inside a private royal collection. There could have been an administrative error. There could have been an informal arrangement. There could have been a transfer that was never properly entered. Or there could have been another explanation that the records had not yet revealed. The investigation could not choose between those possibilities without more evidence. Catherine was reportedly frustrated by the uncertainty, but she remained careful. She knew that the difference between suspicion and proof mattered. Still, one question kept returning. If the brooch had been intentionally preserved, why had nobody told William? That question carried more weight because of the handwritten note. The alleged instruction attributed to Queen Elizabeth did not automatically settle ownership. It was not treated as a court judgment or a substitute for estate documentation. But if authentic, it could reveal what the late monarch intended for the jewel. That made the missing paper trail even more significant. An instruction can be ignored by accident. It can be misunderstood. It can be placed in the wrong file. But if people knew about it and chose not to act, the story would become very different. The palace therefore needed to establish who had access to the note. The search moved through private correspondence, inventory folders, and records connected to household custodians. Investigators were looking for any mention of the brooch, the intended recipient, or a direction from Elizabeth concerning Diana's personal effects. Nothing immediately produced the answer. Then a reference surfaced that pointed toward a previous private review. The wording was cautious, but it suggested that questions about certain Diana-related items had been raised before. If the issue had already been noticed, then Catherine's discovery was not necessarily the first warning. It could have been the first time the object itself had been located. William was reportedly shown the reference. His reaction was described as controlled, but the implications were obvious. If an earlier review had identified uncertainty around Diana's possessions, why had the matter not been resolved? Again, there was no automatic proof of concealment. There was, however, a reason to keep digging. The palace could not close the inquiry while basic questions remained unanswered. Then came the private meeting. According to the account, Camilla was asked to explain how the sapphire had come to be among her possessions. She did not reportedly accept the premise that the jewel had been improperly acquired. Her explanation was that items connected to the royal family had sometimes been preserved privately rather than displayed publicly. The brooch, she suggested, could have been held for safekeeping rather than personal ownership. That explanation mattered because it offered a possible innocent route, but it created another problem. If the jewel was being preserved for safekeeping, where was the record confirming that arrangement? Officials reportedly asked whether there had been written permission. The answer did not immediately produce the document they wanted. They asked whether the brooch had ever been formally transferred. The paperwork was unclear. They asked whether William or Harry had been notified. No clear notification record was identified in the material under review. And then came the question that nobody could comfortably avoid. What did Camilla know about the instruction attributed to Queen Elizabeth? According to the story, that question was met with caution. Camilla reportedly did not accept that the note established an obligation to hand over the brooch. Its authenticity, context, and legal meaning still needed to be assessed. That position was technically important. Even an authentic personal note does not necessarily carry the same force as a formal legal instrument. But emotionally, the distinction did little to calm the situation. William was not looking only at legal ownership. He was looking at what his grandmother had allegedly intended. He was looking at a jewel associated with his mother. And he was looking at the fact that Catherine had discovered it in a place he had never expected to find it. The family disagreement was now becoming unavoidable. Catherine reportedly remained beside William during the discussions, but she did not turn the meeting into an accusation. Her focus stayed on the evidence. That restraint made the tension sharper. Nobody needed to shout. The unanswered questions were doing enough damage on their own. Then investigators found something that shifted the focus again. A record connected to the private inventory appeared to have been updated after the period in which the brooch was believed to have entered the collection. The timing mattered. If the entry had been created later, investigators needed to know why. Was it a correction? Was it a retrospective classification? Or had someone attempted to regularize an item whose earlier history was unclear? No conclusion could be reached from the timing alone, but the investigators now had a specific point to examine. Who made the change? That question led to another search through administrative records. Names appeared, dates were compared, responsibilities were mapped, and suddenly the investigation was no longer moving around an empty space. It was moving toward people who had handled the paperwork. That development created a new kind of pressure. If an individual had simply made an innocent clerical mistake, the matter could be corrected. If several people had known about the discrepancy and left it unresolved, the explanation would become harder. If anyone had deliberately hidden the provenance, the consequences would be far more serious. But before anyone could be blamed, the investigators needed one final piece. They needed to establish whether the alleged Elizabeth note had been known to the people responsible for the brooch. That was the missing link. Without it, the case remained a troubling inventory dispute. With it, the entire meaning of the discovery could change. William reportedly wanted the investigation kept private until that question was answered. He understood that a public accusation would be impossible to reverse, even if later evidence disproved it. That restraint was important. It also meant the public would hear almost nothing while the most sensitive questions were being asked behind closed doors. The story was becoming larger than the palace wanted. And then, just as officials were preparing to determine who had known about the alleged instruction, a new document surfaced. It appeared to connect the private inventory with an earlier decision involving the brooch. The document did not name a culprit. It did something more dangerous. It showed that the jewel's unusual status may have been known before Catherine ever opened the box. That meant the discovery might not have exposed a new problem. It might have exposed an old one. For William, that possibility was the hardest part to absorb. The question was no longer only where Diana's sapphire had gone. It was who had seen the warning signs and allowed the mystery to remain unresolved. And now the palace had to confront that question without destroying trust inside the family. If you believe William deserves to know who knew about that instruction, stay here, subscribe, and share this story, because the next chapter goes straight to the final evidence, and what it reveals makes the tears in the title mean something completely different. The answer was not hidden in the jewelry box anymore. It was sitting in the paperwork. By this point, investigators had one disputed sapphire brooch, one handwritten note attributed to Queen Elizabeth, and a trail of records that failed to explain how the piece reached Camilla's private collection. The final task was simple: determine whether the documents could connect those pieces into one credible history. The review of the newly surfaced administrative record reportedly produced the strongest clue yet. A later inventory entry appeared to acknowledge the brooch without clearly explaining its original transfer. That did not prove anyone had deliberately concealed it, but it suggested the item's unusual status had been known inside the household. That distinction mattered. The mystery was no longer only about possession. It was about knowledge. Investigators reportedly compared the date of that entry with the period surrounding the alleged Elizabeth instruction. If the note had existed before the brooch was placed in private custody, the timing would become critical. If the note had been discovered only later, its significance would be different. The chronology, therefore, became the final battlefield. Who had the jewel first? Who recorded it? Who knew about the instruction? And why was the intended destination never made obvious? The available evidence still left room for more than one explanation. A private arrangement could have been misunderstood. A household transfer could have been recorded incorrectly. An old instruction could have been separated from the formal estate paperwork. None of those possibilities could be dismissed simply because the story was emotionally powerful. But none could explain away the contradiction either. The alleged note said the sapphire was to be preserved for William's future wife. The physical brooch had been found elsewhere. That was the point at which William reportedly stopped treating the matter as an ordinary family disagreement. He wanted the provenance settled. According to the account, senior officials were asked to prepare a complete summary of the evidence. The summary included the brooch's identifying characteristics, the relevant inventory references, the disputed private holding, and the handwritten instruction. The conclusion was cautious. There was enough uncertainty to justify returning the brooch to a controlled royal collection process, while ownership and provenance were clarified. That decision changed the atmosphere. The jewel was no longer sitting privately in the same place where Catherine had discovered it. It was now being handled as a disputed historical object. For Catherine, that mattered because the discovery had never been about taking something for herself. Her role had been to bring an unexplained object to official attention. For William, the emotional significance was harder to contain. The story describes him looking again at the sapphire and then at the handwritten note. The two objects represented different things. The brooch connected him to Diana. The note connected him to Elizabeth. Together, they created a painful bridge between two generations he had lost. That was reportedly when the tears became impossible to hide. The title's most emotional moment was not supposed to be about a man overwhelmed by a valuable jewel. It was about a son confronted with the possibility that something connected to his mother had survived, been preserved, and remained out of his knowledge for years. Yet even then, William could not simply declare the story settled. The note still needed context. An instruction written by a monarch is not automatically the same as a legally binding testamentary document. The provenance of the paper matters, the date matters, the circumstances matter, the authority behind the instruction matters. Those limitations prevented the investigation from becoming a simple accusation. They also made the unanswered question more compelling. If the note was authentic, what exactly did Queen Elizabeth intend? The most straightforward reading was preservation for William's future wife. But preservation could mean several things. It could mean a private family gift. It could mean temporary custody. It could mean an intention that required another formal step. That ambiguity became essential. The palace therefore had a choice: treat the note as a family instruction with emotional importance, or dismiss its practical significance because the formal paperwork was incomplete. The story suggests that William chose neither extreme. Instead, he wanted the evidence preserved and the jewel's history properly recorded. Camilla's position also remained unresolved. There was no established proof from the material presented that she personally ordered the brooch to be hidden or deliberately ignored Elizabeth's alleged instruction. The fact that it was found in her private jewelry box raised questions, but questions were not proof. That distinction is important because the most powerful version of this story does not need an invented confession. The mystery itself is enough. A sapphire connected to Diana appeared where it was not expected. A record failed to provide a clear transfer. A handwritten note allegedly directed its preservation for William's future wife. And the family had to confront the possibility that the instruction had never been properly followed. Eventually, the brooch could be placed into secure custody while its provenance continued to be assessed. The precise final ownership remained a matter for documentation rather than emotion. But something else had already changed. Catherine had forced a forgotten question into the open. William had been given a reason to examine his mother's surviving legacy with fresh eyes, and the palace had been reminded that private family history does not remain private forever when objects, records, and memories begin contradicting one another. The story also left behind a more uncomfortable lesson. Royal families preserve objects because objects carry history, but preservation means little if the history attached to those objects disappears from the record. A sapphire can survive for generations, A paper trail can vanish in a decade. A memory can be protected by one person and forgotten by another. That is why the alleged Queen Elizabeth note became more important than its size suggested. It represented an intention that might otherwise have disappeared completely. For Catherine, finding the brooch may have been accidental. For William, discovering its alleged destination was anything but ordinary. He had spent his life carrying the memory of Diana under extraordinary public attention. He knew that every photograph, every piece of jewelry, and every surviving letter could become a symbol. This one became a symbol of something more personal, a reminder that the past can return without warning, a reminder that records can leave questions behind, and a reminder that family history is not always as neatly preserved as the palace walls suggest. The most haunting part is that the investigation may never establish a single dramatic culprit. There may have been no secret plot. There may have been no deliberate order to hide anything. There may simply have been years of private decisions, incomplete records, assumptions, and misplaced documentation. But if that is what happened, it raises another question. How could something allegedly intended for William's future wife remain outside the obvious family record for so long? That question is what makes the discovery difficult to forget. The real story is the missing explanation surrounding it, and the people who left that gap behind inside palace records. And for William, the tears were not the end of the matter. They were the moment when the past became present again. Catherine had opened a box expecting jewelry. Instead, she opened a question that reached across generations. Diana's memory was attached to the sapphire. Elizabeth's alleged instruction was attached to the note. William's grief was attached to both. And Catherine became the person who brought all three into the same room. Whether every claim surrounding the discovery can ultimately be proven is a separate question. What remains powerful is the central mystery. How did an heirloom associated with Diana come to rest in a private jewelry box? And why was its alleged intended future never clearly recorded? That is the question the palace would have to live with long after the box was closed. And perhaps that is why William's reaction matters. Not because a sapphire made him cry. Because for one moment, the distance between a grieving son, a lost mother, a late grandmother, and the woman standing beside him seemed to disappear. The jewel became more than jewelry. It became a test of what the royal family chooses to preserve, what it chooses to record, and what it chooses to explain. Catherine found the object. The investigation found the contradiction. The note supplied the mystery. But the unanswered question remains the one that matters most. Who knew? And if someone knew, why was William never told? If you believe Diana's legacy deserves transparency instead of silence, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, and share this story. Do it because staying silent leaves unanswered questions buried, while standing with the story keeps them visible. And stay close, because the next video coming on this channel goes even deeper into the royal secrets, disputed treasures, and family decisions that the public was never meant to question.